It is March 2nd, 2021, which means my first cousin, Joseph, it's his birthday. Happy birthday, Joseph. Ryan Ray here, Feeding the Dragon Show, Feeding the Dragon Podcast. If you miss any of this, you can get it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever good podcasts are found. I'm always joined by the one, the only, Miss Fenton. How's it going, Mr. Fenton?
You know, I always think you're the one and the only, so I'm glad we're in the same boat there. I like the fact that you got a family member with a birthday this week, as do I, my 50th.
I didn't know if you wanted to bring that up on the show or not. I didn't know if you wanted, so I was going to leave that alone.
You know, I tweeted out a card that I opened up today a little early by accident, and it said, "If I were a dog, I'd be dead by now." So, which is very true. I'd be what is that, 350 years old almost. So thank God I'm not a dog. Anyway, it's awesome to still be alive at 50. And I'm hoping to be around a lot longer. That's why we need to talk about China, because I don't want to live in a Cold War with that other superpower. So let's figure out how to solve some issues today.
Let me just say thank you, China. Thank you. They are the gift that keeps on giving. So thank you. We're feeding the dragon. They're feeding us news stories. We've got a good thing going back and forth here, because every time I think, well, it's going to slow down, it's going to dry up, then something comes, whether it's anal swab stories from Japan or Australia stories. We've got a lot to get into today, so let's get to it. First, you were on the Steve Cortes show, I think last time we talked. I know you had a good discussion there. Maybe break it down quickly for folks and where they can find that, so if they want to go hear that discussion.
Yeah, I posted it on Twitter. I was on Steve Cortes yesterday. I did 2 segments with him, so I think about 19 minutes of interview. And what I loved about it in particular, and I talked quite a bit about it, is the fact that, I mean, let's face it, Steve Cortes is on the right. He's extremely strong on, you know, the Trump campaign and all that other kind of stuff. What I did was I found very good common ground with him. And then on top of it, he cited the CBS This Morning segment that was on 2 Saturdays ago as a tremendously strong and controversial segment that he was proud that CBS aired. So we talked quite a bit about that. So what was interesting is we had a right side platform and a left side platform that he was citing and talked quite a bit about and has been talking about throughout the last week, showcasing the fact that we have right and left unified on this challenge that China is creating on America. And that, to me, is the secret ingredient to figuring out how to move forward with China. We need to unite as a nation on this common challenge. And I talk about it quite often, that maybe the silver lining of all this China threat, all this China challenge on Americans, it might be that one thing that helps unite both sides, at least on one common thread.
Okay, very good. A couple of stories that are kind of percolating out there. One getting a little bit more traction than the other. Dr. Seuss, there's some talks about, and I haven't dug into this as much as you have. I know there's some talk about removing some books or changing some books, something like that. But then the other thing that kind of slipped through the cracks was Twitter removed some Russian, Armenian, Iranian accounts for undermining the faith in NATO. Now, these are, at face value, you might think they're kind of different stories, but they have a similar thread, which is trying to position public opinion and public discussion in a certain perspective. It has very much a CCP feel to it. Also, speaking of CCP, Ben Samuel says, if you run ad campaigns for cotton swabs, you might get CCP sponsorship. I think the Q-tip people should sponsor the Olympics. I think that would be a nice touch. So what's your take on the Dr. Seuss Twitter censorship, book burning stories that we're hearing today?
Well, by the way, on the China story and the fact that it's a gift that keeps on giving, I would also argue on top of cotton swabs, if we talk about some sort of cure for herpes, we might be able to get some sort of sponsorship too, as the gift that keeps on giving, and relating it to the China stories that we talk about every day. But anyway, this, I don't know what to say about all of this private company talk about censoring things and having the right as a private company, yet most of us are using it as ways to voice opinions, voice criticism. A lot of our journalists are using these social media platforms to cover news and to talk about news and to show opinions. This idea censoring anything is a little scary in a free democratic society where freedom of the press and freedom of speech is so valuably protected. It's so inherent to being American. So I don't know how to think about all this. And on top of it, you and I were talking before the show about this Dr. Seuss situation where the publishers have decided not to publish 6 more books and are removing them from libraries. Look, I don't want to tread into the reasons that the racist history and all that kind of stuff. That is something that is out of my lane and something that true experts should talk about. Where I can bring that story into play is bringing it into the lane of China. And I know if you look behind me, I have a Looper poster. A lot of times I talk about that time travel thriller in the fact that it takes place in the present day and in the future. And one of the most difficult things to navigate with the CCP is the ability to get content in that either talks about the past or talks about the future, because the CCP and the Ministry of Propaganda that reports to the Communist Party are so careful and nuanced about how history is depicted and how they got here today as modern day China and how the future of modern day China is supposed to be told. They want to control every aspect of that narrative. And when you start taking books out of circulation in the United States of America, for whatever those reasons are, you are trying to recreate our history a little bit for a particular narrative. And it's just hard for me not to think that there are similarities there. And I get the fact there's apples and oranges involved in this, but there's definitely some similarities too.
Well, yeah. So let's parse them out. When you talk about undermining the faith in NATO as a bannable offense from Twitter, it's just weird because that is something that you would hear from a totalitarian regime. Like, you can't undermine the faith. Well, NATO is an organization that mainly the U.S. is NATO. Let's call it the spade here. Without us, there is no NATO. So you have that. You see that. It's like, okay, well, then you see the Dr. Seuss story. And then I was reminded, as you were saying this about, I had Ted Cruz on the show the other day we talked about, and someone sent me a 3-line email blasting me for having him on. Okay. In the U.S., Ted Cruz can come on my show and he can rip the Biden administration and say whatever he wants about him. In China, a member of the non-ruling party would not have those privileges. So whether it's Ted Cruz ripping Joe Biden or AOC ripping Donald Trump, we have to be careful that we don't get to a spot to where we talk about rewriting history or talking about the future. Just right here, right now, we've taken for granted the ability for the non-ruling party to critique the ruling party. And that is a fundamental thing that we need to have, and we need to be able to express and explore. So when you go back, you talk about books of history. Well, it's the same principle. What are these books? What are they about? What are the relevance? Why did they do what they did? Do we think that's good today, bad today? Those are all discussions to have, but to kind of say, no, we got to nip it in the bud. There's a line we can't cross for public discourse. That is a very scary precedent. And for me, it goes back to just this simple thing of you want to be able to critique the party in power. And so we start about books or these fringe ideas. You say, well, we can cut that discussion off. Well, eventually you get to the core ideas, which is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about, even in my book, about the fact that, anybody born on or around 1989 or thereafter in China has never seen a photo of the guy holding back the tank there prior to around 1989 or thereafter in China. Do you hear that?
Sorry, it busted. Maybe
what I said was so powerful you wanted to press replay, right? So, but anyway, that tank picture, the picture of the guy holding back the tank, that is something that no one has seen born around that date or thereafter if they lived in China their whole life. And to think that, I don't know, maybe at some point we'll have children or adults that have never come across certain books because we've banished them from libraries or from being published. It just seems a little icky. I'm not going to get too in the weeds on it, but there are definitely similarities to what happens in China. I think we'd be non-honest or dishonest to ourselves if we didn't believe there are some similarities, but there are also some differences too. So I want to be sensitive to that. As far as, the NATO situation, that one is interesting because there has been all kinds of criticisms over the influence and the constructiveness of NATO. Even, yes, I know Donald Trump, our former president, had talked about the fact that it seemed to be almost way too heavily financed by the United States of America, and he wanted others to shoulder that burden. But there's also all kinds of different conflicting events and policy that all the different countries involved have. And let's face it, is Russia really that Cold War entity that we had back when this was formed? I don't know. I would argue that maybe we should be focused more east than towards I guess it is the east of Europe.
Yeah, no, I will clearly state that Russia is not the threat that we like to keep them in and about and being. And that kind of brings me to just you talk about Russia. Let's kind of go to Saudi Arabia, because I was thinking about something. I know we want to talk about kind of how we deal with the MBS situation, and let's go back to that report that was released last Friday, I guess it is now. And I've thought about this a little bit since we talked about it, and maybe we said some of these things. But one is the Biden administration teed this up last Tuesday or Wednesday, I think, that they're going to release it, and that it finally comes out on Friday, which is the news dump time to kind of get it buried. And the media has kind of stayed on them to recover it. But when you go read the document, one of the things I found interesting, Chris, and you think about in the broader context of how do we respond to intelligence information? If you go read the document, there's not a whole lot there. Like, it's not enough to get a murder conviction. It's not enough to really do much with. It's just kind of, hey, Chris is there. Chris knows everything. It can't have happened without Chris knowing. So therefore, Chris ordered the code red. How do you think about that? I want to talk about the implications of not doing anything on the Saudis in a second, but how do we think about that as far as our intelligence community and how they handle China? Because this was a pretty paper thin report.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, there's a lot of holes in our intelligence with all countries. I mean, there's only so much that we're going to be able to dive into, and it's waded us into waters that have gotten us in a lot of trouble in the past. I mean, we've talked about the weapons of mass destruction conclusion that we made in order to invade Iraq. I think the MBS situation, I mean, that there's only so much governance that's done in Saudi Arabia that has anything to do outside of MBS or his father, right? So the idea that a bunch of thugs just went and did this by themselves seems pretty hard to believe.
Sure,
so I feel pretty comfortable that they actually came up with a strong conclusion, but maybe the evidence wasn't as stiff as it needed to be. But that said, we know there's human rights issues in Saudi Arabia anyway. I mean, I don't know what they do with homosexuals and various other, people that go against their laws, but I think they stone them or hang them or do something to them, behead them in town squares or whatever it is. I mean, it's obvious, right, what they do. And look at what they've been doing with Yemen. And we still have these very ambiguous policies with Saudi Arabia where it doesn't seem like there's strong ramifications for some of the things that are super valuable to what we believe in as Americans. And if we don't follow through on some of these things that we are so hard on China with on other countries, then it actually, diminishes the threat. It diminishes our fortitude. It diminishes our unification on trying to push for change in China.
I would just simply add two things. One is that if we're going to cancel the Dr. Seuss books, like if that's a thing, then we should really think about, do we cancel buying Saudi Arabian oil? Like how far are we getting serious about these perceived atrocities or these perceived offenses? And so, this is the ultimate problem when you go down this path is, there's plenty of things out there. As for, the Saudis and China, here's how I thought about it since we talked last Friday, I believe. You to be consistent, you'd almost have to classify the countries. And here's what I mean. So let's say you had like a tier 1 system. So China, Saudis, Russia, whatever, they're all in tier 1. And so if they do something, here is the response for tier 1. But Nigeria, which has its own human rights issues, you couldn't treat them the same way you do the Saudis or the Chinese. And if you work your way down to all the trade partners with the U.S., you're going to get to some just about everyone's got some human rights issues, some worse than others, but not all nations are created equal. They're just not. They don't have all the GDP and the growth and the military, the police. So you have to be careful saying, well, if China does this and the Saudis do this, and so we don't have that classification to my knowledge, and so I think that may be part of the reason you see kind of this helter-skelter pattern is that we don't really have a way to group these nations. And I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, but it would seem like you'd have to before you figure out what is an appropriate punishment for the Saudis or the Chinese.
Right. Well, I think part of the issue is some of these countries that are not tier one. We don't have a lot of exchange of commerce and culture and various other military aid or whatever it is, right? So there's a couple kinds of punishment. One is, whoa, there's atrocities happening there. Let's invade them with our military, dethrone whoever the leadership is, take over that country, put in who we think is going to be a better leader. There's that. But then there's also the less drastic version, which is, hey, we don't agree with what you're doing over there. We're not going to sell you arms anymore. We're not going to provide any sort of financial support. We're not going to do any trade with you. We're definitely not going to censor content or work on the cultural fabric of what that exchange is between the two until you fix it, right? So if you look at some of these African countries, we don't have this massive sort of system of exchange of different elements of both of our countries going on. So really the form of punishment would be invading them and dethroning leadership. But that doesn't seem to be the smartest thing to do because it's just a whack-a-mole. And as we know with Iraq, you replace one with a vacuum or whatever it is, and suddenly you got a serious problem. So in the case of these tier one countries, I think we lead by example with them, which is, hey, African countries, if you're going to be doing this stuff and at some point you rise in stature as an economy and as a nation that's engaged with the United States of America, you're going to have a problem doing business with us or having whatever that exchange is, because look at what we've done with Saudi Arabia in retaliation for some of the wrongs that they have been doing or what we've been doing with China. There's a real lead by example in this idea that if these African countries want to aspire into that tier one level, they need to follow the same rules of engagement that we're applying to those tier one nations. But right now, we don't have a rule of engagement with tier one nations.
Yeah, we don't. And the only concern is that if you start making these rules, China will say, screw the rules. We don't care about the rules. So the U.S. you get pissed off the U.S. and you come to us. Our arms are wide open. So a great example of this is you have Iran, which claims to be the purveyor of all things, protecting Muslims all over the world, and yet they don't say anything about the Uyghurs because they struck a big deal with China. So, so like you have these Middle Eastern countries who would gladly work with China in terms of the U.S. So I think it's just one of those things where if we, listen, I think the guy he ordered the code red, he wanted him killed. I agree with all that. Also, they do all kinds of other terrible things. I'm not sure that what the U.S. government can do is really put enough pressure on them to be effective. And so I would just caution that if we are going to do something, we have to classify. And if we're going to classify, we have to be consistent. And I have little faith in our government to do either of those things. Uh-oh, look at this. There he is.
Hey, but by the way, one thing I want to bring up about this Muslim thing, because I've seen the Iran comparison, is that you got to, and by the way, no one's in this nuance, and I'm not a Middle East expert, but this seems like journalism 101. Iran is run by Shiite Muslims. It's mainly Shiite, right? The Uyghurs are Sunni Muslims. So they might as well be mortal enemies. I mean, the Sunnis and the Shiites do not get along. So I can see why the Iranians don't really care what's happening with the ethnic cleansing or the atrocities or whatever's happening in the Xinjiang province, right? I mean,
yeah, so my understanding,
that's something that's
my understanding
that no one's talking about.
Right. So I will leave it to the Middle Eastern experts who know better than I do. But from my understanding, Iran postures itself to be the one who stands up for Muslim rights around the world. Whether that's true or not, that's their outward positioning. So even if it's a Shiite Sunni deal, that they take that stance globally, and they don't do it with the Uyghurs. So I got that from someone go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I think, I mean, I had some engagement with Saudi Arabia in the past, and I just think Sunnis and Shiites are about as distant as it gets in regards to sharing any common core value other than that religion. Like, they do not like each other, and they've been warring against each other for a long time, right? So I don't know, but we should have a Middle Eastern expert on and talk about this a little bit if this continues to be a story that no one's covering the nuance of.
Okay. He says you're correct. Now I'll ask Man United. I'm almost positive I got what I'm saying from Ellen, so that's why I'm saying that. And so I'll ask Ellen again. But my understanding is, if I remember what Ellen said correctly, she was mocking or pointing out the Iranians' hypocrisy on this issue. But
you're talking about Ellen DeGeneres?
No, Ellen Wald.
I'm kidding. No.
Ellen DeGeneres and me, we talk about movies. We don't talk about politics. So
okay, good. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I'm actually surprised that we're not seeing anybody dive into that nuance there, because there is a real interesting argument as to where is the Muslim world in regards to what's happening in Xinjiang, and why is there no solidarity around that?
Okay, so in China, there is, I'm sure, a bunch of movies open, but I believe Disney has one coming out this weekend. Chris, what's the story with that?
Yeah, well, they have Raya and the Last Dragon coming out, which is the first movie that they've released since the Mulan issue. And that Mulan issue obviously is still fresh in a lot of people's minds. And what's interesting too about Raya and the Last Dragon is that it involves a dragon, which is a mythical beast, which is extremely ingrained in the culture of China. I haven't seen the movie. I don't know if they've actually made it China relevant per se, but dragons, as Nike and LeBron James know from 2004, if you handle the nuance of that mythology the wrong way, you can be in a lot of trouble and blackballed in that market. So I'm curious, A, how it plays. There have been the How to Train Your Dragon movies there that have done relatively well, 60, 70 million in that box office. My guess is that's probably something that Disney would like to see. I doubt they'll get there. We'll find out. But, I don't have high hopes for our domestic movies doing well in that market anymore. And especially ones coming from a bit of a taint on Disney right now. I don't have high hopes.
Okay, so what I got excited about, I said in the pre-show I had something I was going to ask you, and I couldn't remember. I remembered Godzilla versus King Kong. My man, it's coming out March 31st. Two things. How big is this in China, in the Chinese market versus the U.S. market? And then two, they said that the director said there's a definitive winner in the Godzilla versus King Kong fight. Will that be any influence on China? Like, does Godzilla need to win over King Kong? Is there any attachment to these characters from their perspective? Or is it just going to be a good old rock'em sock'em knockout? Or any insights on that?
Well, number one is, remember that Godzilla is a Japanese mythology, which is a nation that China doesn't particularly like all that much anyway. So the relevancy is a little muted, if not negative, with that movie. Now, let's face it, it's going to be a big rock'em sock'em type of loud sound effect, huge scale type of film, which is the kind of thing that from Hollywood, Chinese consumers love to watch. So that will counter the Godzilla IP from Japan. But the other thing that's going to counter the opposite direction is the fact that Warner Brothers is releasing the movie. Yes, Legendary, which made the movie, is Wanda owned, which is a Chinese company. So there's a little bit of wind to the back there. Mm-hmm. But on top of it, Warner Brothers is also the proud owner of HBO Max, which is taking a shot on that COVID last breath documentary, which could work against them. So there's a lot of conflicting forces as to whether that movie will work. And then on top of it, you got the fact that Hollywood is American, and American goods and services are looked pretty poorly on by the Chinese consumer at the moment, because the rhetoric about America on the ground in China is not good, just like it's not good towards China here in the United States.
Okay, so yeah, the Pacific Rim films, they did pretty good in China, right?
Yes, those did very well.
Okay, and so you're saying that the Japanese tied to Godzilla might put a little pushback on it, So would that maybe just out of curiosity, would that maybe influence the filmmakers to make King Kong win the fight over Godzilla because that would appeal better to the Chinese audience?
That's a good question. I don't know who won, and I don't really know.
It's not out till March 31st. I'm just curious. Like the director just said, like in an interview this week, there is a definitive winner.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that right now Warner Brothers probably isn't looked at in the best light by the government, and the government is the one that is essentially the gatekeeper, number one. Number two is Hollywood's not looked at in the best light by the Chinese consumers, so that's number two working against it. Number three is Godzilla is an IP from Japan. That's three working against it. And then on the pros, you got Wanda owning Legendary, Chinese ownership. That's one. Two, big, loud explosions, all that other kind of stuff, which is two. So, it's going to be a push and pull, sort of like Godzilla versus King Kong, as to whether the box office results are big or not. My guess is it's going to be a disappointment, but how big a disappointment, I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, I took that to mean that Chris is predicting King Kong will finish Godzilla. That's what I took from all that. So that's his official King Kong Godzilla prediction. Okay, we do have.
Well, you know what? I'm looking. I just wanted to see what the last Godzilla movie did. I'm just looking it up right now. That did 100. First of all, domestically in the U.S., it only did 111 million. But in China, it did 135 million. So what's interesting about that is my guess is that it won't get to 100 million in China. Let's see.
All right, so I'll tell you what, I'm going to jot that down. 100 million in China. And you're predicting King Kong knocks out Godzilla. If Kong knocks out Godzilla, then that taps into the China market, right?
By the way, we don't even know right now. I don't think there's a release date in China. I don't think they've gotten approval to release it in China.
Oh, okay. Too. That is interesting. So it's March 31st here in the States, theater and HBO Max. We'll see.
And one other thing I'll add is that if the Chinese government wants to be super sneaky against Warner Brothers in retaliation for that documentary, they could delay the release to well after it's released around the world, allow the black market to get their hands on all the pirated DVDs, and allow the consumer to engage in that movie through the black market and through really cheap DVDs, and then allow Warner Brothers to release the movie to a market that's already seen it for the most part. So that's been done before. I'm curious, maybe they do that again.
Okay, we do have a question here. I don't know if you follow soccer or if my man, you man would say real football. Any comments on that?
Well, I know, and I don't know how you pronounce his name. Is it Zoltan Abramovich? I know he's been very vocal about China, right? And there has been issues about that. I am now super curious to follow this exchange, and I'll be happy to tweet it out or talk about it on the next podcast. So thanks for the tip.
I saw LeBron responding to him, and I wasn't quite sure the full context. So I didn't go look it up either. I didn't know it was China related. I thought it was something else related. So we'll check it out and see if we can get it in. What's today? Tuesday. Yeah, we'll have another show this week. Okay. Let's see here. A couple of things we'll hit real quick. Australia and China, the relationship there seems to be on rocks, deteriorating even worse as Australia came out today, and one of the senators was, oh gosh, I don't have it pulled up here, but he was basically, if you can help me out here, Chris, that would be great. I can't remember what he said. Where's it at? I don't have it. Anyways, they were.
Well, the
calling the Uyghurs genocide. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And so this is backtrack here. The China laid the hammer on Australia for simply suggesting that they wanted the WHO to go investigate the origins of COVID-19. They didn't say it came from a lab. They didn't say there was malfeasance. They said that they just wanted an investigation, and China lost their mind on them. If they go full, it's a genocide. I mean, I don't know what else China can do, but that's about as bad as it can get for those two nations, huh?
Well, look, I mean, you have a few nations that are going that direction, right? Canada too. And I think Australia feels a little bit left out to dry on this statement. I'm curious whether they follow through on anything about that designation. Obviously, they've been doing it on the commodities front, but yet they also joined that big trade pact with China and the rest of the ASEAN countries. Curious to see how it plays out with the Olympics. But if it's just Australia doing things, it's going to be a whack-a-mole, and they're going to really suffer. And the rest of the Western alliance that puts their head in the sand and just continues to play ball with China is going to benefit off of Australia's sacrifice, right? Which is not right. By the way, I was just looking at the LeBron controversy. I guess Zoltan's big thing was just, hey, athletes should remain athletes and not talk politics. That's an interesting one. I mean, I feel like if you have a platform and you can create some sort of constructive good based on what you believe in, I'd argue you might as well use that platform. It's very rarefied air. And you know what? There's ramifications for speaking out on whatever that topic is. You could get penalized for it by your bosses or owners or any of that kind of stuff. And then on top of it, your nation could have problems with what you're saying or what you're not saying. But one thing I would say to Manchester United is that if LeBron is speaking out about things like we're talking about with the United States of America, it would be nice if there's a consistency of how they're speaking about things. Like if it is human rights issues or the struggle of obviously minorities here in the United States of America, perhaps you apply that same tactic to the markets that the NBA provides a platform also for you, which China would be one of them. It would be nice to see that consistency, but I don't blame LeBron for not having that consistency because our own country doesn't seem to have that consistency. So it's a super nuanced, complicated situation, but I'm just looking at that exchange now. And then back to Australia. I mean, yes, let's not hang them out to dry. Like if they're going to take a position, we should try to create the leverage with them to actually indicate that we want to pursue some change with China and the engagement with China.
Yeah, real quick on that was the LeBron comment I saw was responding to that, and he does say in that, so that was the right exchange, that that he's going to talk about his community, kind of the going up from Akron and the injustice there, but he does say he's going to talk about things around the world, and so I thought, okay, well maybe there's hope that he will address something with the Uyghurs or with Hong Kong or with China at some point. Real quick, just a quick update because we mentioned the HBO Max documentary in the same breath. The best I can find is it's scheduled to release spring 2021, which means there is no public release date. If you go to hbomax.com or whatever it is, it says coming soon. On looper.com, it has in spring 2021. So we will be following that story when it comes out. We will watch it and obviously have I'm sure, in-depth discussion of it. Okay, let's see here. We have just maybe a quick minute. I know, just real quick, let me just throw this out here. We stand with Japan for no more anal swabs. We just stand there with them. I know that's still a recurring story. So Japanese citizens, we're on your side. But on a more serious note, Chris, CPAC, I know you had some comments about that. You were, I think I saw some of it. You followed it a little bit closer than I did. What was your takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't watch it super closely. I don't get into the whole political stuff as much as some do, but I was curious to see how much they talked about China, and there was a lot of talk about China, a lot of talk about the threat of China and the challenge that China poses on all Americans. I thought it was, great to get on the Cats Roundtable and Steve Cortes and some of the other stuff that I have upcoming to talk about the issue on the right as well as on the left. CPAC is keeping that China challenge out there front and center, which is really nice. I watched some of Trump's speech. I didn't see him talk too much about China. He did allude to it several times. And I do find it interesting that CPAC comes up right around the time of the two sessions, which is the meeting of the National People's Congress and the People's Political Consultative Conference, right? The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, what do they call it? The CPPCC, right? It's just sort of interesting timing. And I'm curious to see what comes out of that. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. We talk about Bill Bishop and cynicism. He's been covering his thoughts of where some of the directives are going to come. A lot of those directives are already pushed through the system. So all the National People's Congress does, which is like their congressional arm, but it's really what we call a rubber stamp organization. They're just going to stamp it and say, this is what we're doing. But it will be curious to see what announcements come out, where they're pushing things. Tech, innovation, looking inward, getting self-reliant, in creating independence, particularly as we were talking pre-show on the microchip front. I feel like microchips, that tech that's so instrumental to advancements of technology moving forward. We're starting to see China take that same disposition as they did with GPS back in 93, the World Wide Web in 1997, and now chips moving forward to 2025, which is what their 5-year plan is going to be. We got to be really careful and watch that. I've seen some articles about various U.S. officials talking about choke points in the microchip supply chain where we might be able to create some leverage. I highly recommend we do that. We don't have a lot of time to do it. They're moving forward quick, so we need to think about that really soon. A couple other things too, just to bring up before we close out. I thought your friend of show, Senator Ted Cruz, and the fact that he came out and said maybe we don't use Beijing 2022 as a way to create leverage with China, and it's not fair to the athletes to boycott. I thought that was an interesting point of view. I thought Catherine Tai continues to hold her view as the potential trade rep replacement for Robert Lighthizer. That made me really excited. And then I also saw this cashless push by the Chinese. We talked about them pushing forward cryptocurrency and a new form of like Bitcoin competition, even though a lot of Bitcoin is mined in China. But they're also really pushing this cashless society idea, which they're realizing is a tremendous gold mine of big data to harvest and to track their own people. And that's something really concerning.
Okay. All right. I think that is it.
Wait, did I just cause you? I finished my rant there, and I just saw you go.
Yeah, I mean, no,
what?
You've like, you know, you've kind of rocky there for a second, like, wow, where's he going? And then you navigated all the little storm clouds and you landed the plane perfectly and nothing to add. It was beautiful. It was beautiful.
By the way, what's cool is like now I'm starting to plug this shit. Like now that we got a nice riff on here and we got this podcast going and we're up everywhere. I brought it up with Cortes. I brought it up on Cats Roundtable. I brought it up on News Nation last week. Like I'm going to start pushing, and it's nice to see our numbers keep going up, which is really nice.
Yes, it is. It is. So remind you, yeah, thank you for that. So if you caught any of the live stream on Periscope or YouTube or wherever, this is a podcast, Feeding the Dragon podcast, Apple, Spotify, Overcast, wherever you get good podcasts at. You can find it. We do it 2 to 3 times a week. Would love a 5-star review. That's all we actually take. We don't take anything less. So 5-star reviews. If you leave them, we will read them on the show. And with that, I'm sure today's Tuesday. We'll be back at least 1, maybe 2 more times this week. There's a lot more to cover we didn't get to. And listen, final thought, if someone asks you for an anal swab, just say no. Just say no. That's I still don't know how that's a story in 2021, but I feel sorry for the poor saps who are having to endure it. So
it's a good one. And by the way, like we said, that's one thing MBS has not demanded over there in Saudi Arabia. So that's a plus for him.
Yeah, no anal swabs for them. So all right.
Have a good one, everyone. Thanks for joining.